Welcome to Ray's Reflection, the Common Man's Bible Study. Today we are beginning Acts chapter 20. We are still on Paul's third missionary journey, but I think part of his mission, has changed. He has been taken up a collection for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And this collection is going to create some problems, and you'll see how the Lord directs him to take care of these problems. So in chapter 20, Paul is going to preach in Macedonia, which is obviously Greece, and he says this, verse 1, he says, "And after the uproar was ceased." Now the uproar was in Ephesus. Now Ephesus is being right here. Now Paul leaves. Now you can see he leaves here, and he's going to head up north. It says this, "He called unto him the disciples, and embraced them, and departed to go into Macedonia. And when he had gone over those parts, and had given them much exhortation, he came into Greece." So now he's into Greece. You can see his travel. "And there he abode 3 months. And when the Jews laid wait for him, as he was about to sail into Syria, he proposed to return through Macedonia." In other words, they were ready to nail him and beat him, but he got word. "And there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonican, Aristarchus, and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and of Asia Tychicus and Trophimus." Now, why did they accompany him? And I believe you would see this as a proper way to avoid any accusation. And here he is collecting a large sum of money, and this is quite a sum of money he collected. We don't know exactly what it was, but it was enough so that he would have to have these men assist him in his travel, not just to make sure that the money would reach Jerusalem, but to make sure that other people would not attack them, and to give them a sense of responsibility, or accountability, I should say. And therefore, that is why they're going. "These going before tarried with us in Troas." Now Troas will be way up here. So Paul has crossed over, and he's come back. Now, "And we sailed away from Philippi after those days of unleavened bread, and came onto them in Troas." Now these men that were mentioned up in verse 4, etc., were waiting for Paul in Troas. And now Paul, who has been in Greece, comes into Troas, and it took 5 days, and where we abode 7 days, so they stayed there a week in Troas. "And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread." Now that brings up a point. We often wonder, when did the Jews celebrate their feast, their particular day to worship God? And that was on what we call a Saturday, or to them it was a Sabbath. And now the Christians, etc., now move that worship time 1 day forward to the first week. Instead of the last day of the week, they move it to the first day of the week. And we know that they do that for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is the Old Testament is over. It's finished. And therefore, we leave the Sabbath behind. The new day is going to be Sunday, because it is the day on which the Lord resurrected, which begins a new period of time. So now the Lord is worshipped on the Lord's Day, or on Sunday, and therefore you have to keep that in mind. And they began this quite early, and the tradition has been followed for almost 2,000 years now. He said, "When the disciples came together to break bread," and the breaking of bread has a twofold meaning, and people have a hard time understanding this. One meaning is simply when they came together to eat and to have a meal. And generally, at that meal, before the meal began, they gave thanks to the Lord by having communion. Now, some people will tell you that that's breaking of bread is exclusively communion. Because nowadays, with the size of the churches, etc., it's rather impractical to have a meal and then communion at that meal. So therefore, they just have the communion portion. But in the early churches, they did both together. And that is quite a unique way. So on the first day, when they got together for a meal, they had this communion service at the beginning of the meal. And so this is what the breaking of bread is. He says, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the next day. And he continued to his speech until midnight. We often complained in our day when a pastor goes more than 1 hour long. In fact, we complain when he goes more than 40 minutes long. But here he's starting to preach now. How long, it determines how long a sermon is. What's the time limit? And basically, the time limit, and I think Paul is using it here, the time limit is whatever the custom is of the people. I remember talking to a pastor whose church was growing. He started out with 50 parishioners. And by the time I met him, his church had grown in a very short span of time, like about 2 to 3 years, about 3 years. It was up to 2,000. And he had to have like 3 services in the morning and so on to keep going. And I asked him, I said, how big is your back door? And he said to me, none. He said, the only time people leave our church is when they're moving out of the area for jobs or what have you. I said, well, what's your secret? And he says, very simple. He says, I took a survey and studied the culture of the people. And the culture of the people in today's world is block time. If you look at a person who watches TV, he's block time. Half hour into the show, he's at the refrigerator looking for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Everything is block time. Entertainment is block time. Work is block time. It's by the hour. Then you get work so long, you get a break, and so on. So therefore, a whole society, you go to school, it's block time. And therefore, a whole society has been trained on block time. So he said the next thing we have to do is determine how big is that block time. And his block time was 35 minutes. He said 35 to 40 minutes is the block time for my people. He says, so what I had to do is I had to go back, take a look at the sermons that I had preached before, and reduce them back to block time, to that 35 to 40 minutes. He said, it's the same old sermons. I just had to work at breaking it down. And so that was one view. I've seen missionaries come off the field and tell stories about how some of their people had to walk miles to get there, to get to church, and they would sit there for 2.5, 3 hours and listening to the sermon. And in the early church, the same thing occurred. In the early colonial church, the same thing happened weekly. And this was a time, a social time. This was a time when people got together and the news was spread, because during the week they were all working and they were in their different homes and homesteads and what have you. So what you have to do is you have to look at what the culture of the people, and then go from there and deliver the message. You can deliver the message in many ways. And so Paul here decides to preach till midnight. Why did he want to preach till midnight? Because the people there wanted him to do that. They were willing to sit there and listen to him. They were excited. And what he said was new to them and vibrant, and they ate it right up. He says, And there were many lights in the upper chambers where they were gathered together. And there sat in the window, and I have a picture of this, a certain young man named Eutychus, being fallen into a deep sleep. After all, he's not quite as into the theology, let's say, as the adult members of the gathering. And as Paul was long in preaching, he sank down with sleep and fell down from the third loft and was taken up dead. In other words, third loft would be third floor. He fell third floor, and he was pronounced, for all practical purposes, he was pronounced dead. And Paul went down and fell on him and embraced him. Trouble not yourself, for his life is in him. When he therefore was come up again, and had broken bread, in other words, he had eaten. Now you see the breaking of bread here is, if you say they gathered together to break bread, and then you see that this boy has broken bread, you will see that these things basically include a meal. So when this man had eaten, when this boy rather had eaten bread, had broken bread and eaten, and taken a long while, even till break of day, so he departed. In other words, Paul performed a miracle. And he raised this young man from the dead. And he stayed around till morning. Now he preached till midnight. Then he stayed around till morning, making sure this young man was okay. And they got this young man to eat. And so therefore it was time to leave. When morning arrived, this young man seemed to have been all right. Now, and they brought the young man alive, and they were not a little comforted. In other words, they greatly, greatly rejoiced. Now, they rejoiced for two reasons, and I think you have to understand that. They rejoiced that this young man was brought back from the dead. But something else was seen here. Paul had preached till midnight. How many things did he say? He must have said a tremendous amount of things that they had never heard before. Now, performing this miracle of raising this man from the dead substantiates what he's saying, to substantiate the message that he delivered, because they cannot go to their New Testament and dig into it to find out what it says, or if Paul was telling them the truth. They can't do that. But this substantiates what Paul was saying. In other words, if raising this young boy from the dead is an act of God, then the statements that Paul made are also from God. And therefore they connected this. So this was a great, great comfort to them. And and the other thing, Paul was going to leave. And they, quote, were basically on their own. So Paul performs this miracle, and this miracle, it comforts them a tremendous amount of comfort. In other words, here they are rather sad that Paul is leaving, and they're trying to glean all they can from him. And now he does this act, and to know that God is here in their midst. And the power of God is in their midst. And they are comforted, they are strengthened, they are edified. And therefore, as we see this, we begin to see why miracles were performed then, and miracles, these showy miracles, are not performed today. We see that, and this is one particular reason. Paul is going to leave. Will he ever be back? Well, they don't know that he'll ever be back. He's going to Jerusalem, and he has purposed before that he was going to go to Rome. He's not going to come back to Ephesus. So therefore, they need a stamp of approval of what they have done, what they're going to do, and to let them know that God is in their midst. So when this young boy moves about in the days to come, and he grows, and people watch him, etc., they will always remember that he is a reminder that God is present with them. And that is the comfort that they have. Then it says this, and we went ahead to the ships and sailed to Athos. Now you can see that they're sailing, and basically this was the type of boat along the coast. He wasn't going through the far out to sea. He was staying rather close, and you can see he's up here at Troas. He's going to Assos here, and then he's going to work his way down along the coast, and he's going to leave from Miletus, and he's going to go all the way. This will require a bigger boat here. Now it says this, he went ahead in Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for so had he appointed, minding himself to go afoot. In other words, Paul was going to walk. In other words, but the group that had waited for him in Troas decided, hey, let's take a boat, and they got a hold of Paul and they went to take a boat. And it says this, and when he met with us at Assos, and he met with all of the men there at Assos, we took him in and we came to Mylene. And now Mylene would be, I don't have it here, but I'll let you back up a minute. Mylene would be right here. They didn't go very far. Mytilene. It says this, and we sailed from there and came the next day opposite of Chios, which is not on the map. And the next day we arrived at Samos, and that's not on the map either. But they're sailing down in through this area here. See, now, and we tarried at Trogyllium, and the next day we came to Miletus. Now they're eventually going to end up right here. They end up right here at Miletus. You can see Paul is getting close. For Paul had determined to sail by Ephesus. Now, in other words, he went right by Ephesus, just missing this at all. Why? Because there was a big riot there. And remember, Christianity in Ephesus had grown and it had exploded. And it had had increased such a great amount that it actually changed the economy of the city of Ephesus. And the economy was, they would worship the goddess Diana, and they were making these silver statues of Diana and selling them all over Asia. And therefore people were coming from all over Asia to get these statues and these momentums. And literally the economy of Ephesus was driven by it. And now here comes Christianity. And Paul is basically preaching, you can't make gods. God is not made out of hands. He's the Spirit. He's always been. He's the one who makes things. And therefore Christianity stopped buying these silver statue and these silver momentums and what have you. And the economy of Ephesus was in a turmoil, and so the people were upset, and Demetrius literally got a riot going, and so now Paul is not going back to that mess. He's going to avoid it completely, and so that's what it means here when he said he determined to sail by Ephesus. He didn't want to go back to that riot, because he would not spend the time in Asia, for he hastened, if it were possible for him to be in Jerusalem the day of Pentecost, if he could be back in Jerusalem for the day of Pentecost. Now, so he meets with the elders there, and he's going to give them a last speech sort of thing, a last encouragement, and a last exhortation. And that is going to be the rest, basically the rest of the chapter, all the way through to chapter 21. And so we're going to study that in parts. We're not going to be able to do it all today, but we'll do it in parts, what he taught them. And then he says this, and from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church. So it says, and when they were come to him, he said to them, you know from the first day that I came into Asia, after what manner I had seen with you at all seasons. Now, in other words, notice he didn't say, you know what I said to you. That's not what he said. He said, literally, you have seen an example of how I lived and how I came to you. And therefore, we have different views. He's presenting views of the ministry. And the view is, the first view you're going to see is towards the Lord. That's in verse 19. He says, look, the first view is, we could say, shall we say, serving. And it says right there, the very first word, it says this, serving the Lord with all humility of mind. So when he says, when you go back, when you saw me coming into Asia, etc., you didn't see me coming in on a parade or being announced. I came in humility. And part of that humility included, I came in, got a job, and went to work to support myself. I didn't depend upon handouts. I didn't call for people to give money and so on to help me. I simply went to work, and on my free time, I would give you the gospel. He says this, and with many tears and trials, which befell me by the lying in wait of the Jews. In other words, he said, there was a tremendous opposition against me. And this opposition was by the Jews, and they literally they waited for me, because here was a man, a Jewish man, who came in and told them basically that the Messiah they had been waiting for had already come, and that the old system had come to an end. The old system of worship, the old system of laws, etc., had come to an end. And this upset them terribly. So therefore, literally, in city after city, as the news spread that Paul, this man, was preaching a new message, the Jews would lay in wait. And so Paul took a beating. And this is what he says. He says, which befell me by the lying in wait of the Jews. So therefore, there has to be a view of the ministry. You have to serve the Lord regardless of the opposition laid before you. Now, I have seen missionaries in a particular country, and that particular country, let me say this, that missionary went there because he claimed that God had led him to that place. And in that country, politically things changed, and it got a bit dangerous for the missionaries. So he looked ahead, and he saw that there could be trouble for missionaries, especially foreign missionaries, so he got out of that country. This is not what Paul did. And I do not believe that if the Lord wants you in a particular place, I don't really care if the economics changes, if the politics of that country changes. Very little. If the Lord wants you there, you are as safe as you will be anywhere. And your effectiveness will be the same, will be designed by the Lord. And therefore Paul knew that Jews were laying in wait to cause trouble and to give him some beatings. And it did not deter him. And he did not boast about it, but he was saying that if you are going to serve the Lord, you better be willing to pay the price if the price is required of you. And therefore you can't let that be a deterrent to how you're going to serve the Lord. And I have used that in my life. I have seen things that economically I can't explain. I have a degree. I have an accounting degree. I taught economics for years, along with Bible. And when I look at the things in my life and how things work and how God has laid out the plans for me, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't go along. So we're going to stop, and we're going to the views that we have here. Now let me show it to you. It says we have a view towards the Lord, and that's the one we just discussed. We have a view towards believers, and we have a view towards the unsaved, and we have the view personally, an inward view. And we're going to look at this next week in looking and examining the exhortation that Paul gave these church leaders. So until next week, when we study this, I bid you Godspeed. We'll see you next week.